What if I told you that by discussing this one thing effectively within your GCSE English Literature responses, you could drastically increase the number of marks you receive for your answers? I imagine you'd probably want to give it a go, right? Well, in this video, I'm going to tell you what this one thing is, and then give you 3 tips to help you incorporate it into your work. Before I tell you what this one thing is though, I want to see if you can figure it out. I'm going to put 3 images on the screen, one at a time, and I want you to try and work out what this one thing is. To give you a bit of a clue, this word has 7 letters in it, and the thing itself is actually missing from all 3 of these photographs. So let's have a look. First off, we have a polar bear who has reached his stop on the train, possibly on his way to work during rush hour. Or maybe it isn't a polar bear at all, but a couple of actors in a very convincing polar bear costume, on their way to rehearsals for their starring role in the next David Attenborough documentary.
Polar bears.
That might also explain why these women are just standing there and not screaming and running for their lives, unless they're used to this kind of thing. Next up, we have a child who seems to be rather unhappy at the fact that he's being surrounded by some toy dinosaurs who, by the looks of it, must have seen Jurassic Park and probably Toy Story and decided to launch a revolution against humanity. Or the toy dinosaurs could have been strategically placed there because the child's parent thought it would make for a cute post on Instagram. Finally, we have a horse who could be hiding in the ground with a plan of jumping out and startling the unsuspecting pedestrians in the background. A classic case of horsing around. Hey! Or perhaps the horse is in fact a convicted criminal who's escaped from prison. The humankind, after spending the last 6 years digging their way to freedom with nothing but some tooth floss and a spoon. And now, with the perfect disguise of a horse mask, they're just checking to see if the coast is clear before blending into the crowd, never to be seen or heard from again. What? I said perhaps. So, have you figured out what the thing is that's missing from all 3 of these images? Well, if you said context, then you are absolutely spot on. Congratulations. But if you didn't say context, then not to worry, because this is just a pre-recorded video and I have no way of knowing what your answer was either way. Speaking of not knowing things, we have no clue what is going on in any of these photographs, other than from what we can see and then try to work out for ourselves. We don't have any background information, we don't know anything about the situation or the circumstances that led to these moments, and we don't know what happens afterwards. It's like we've been given one piece of a puzzle and all the other puzzle pieces are being hidden from us. We can't see the bigger picture because we don't have enough context. Now don't get me wrong, the lack of context for these photographs is actually what makes them quite entertaining, but we're only really finding them entertaining because we haven't got a clue what's going on. We can only try to imagine how these bizarre moments came to be, sometimes rather creatively, like I did earlier. So, taking all that into account, context is the background information that helps us to understand the situation and the circumstances in which something has taken place. If you were to ask me the question, is 4 a lot? I wouldn't be able to give you a suitable answer without more information, because the context of the question would change the answer that I give you. For instance, if you're asking me if 4 pence is a lot, then my answer would be no, it isn't. Whereas if you're asking me if 4 murders is a lot, then yeah, absolutely. So knowing background information about what you're discussing is incredibly important. But how can talking about context improve your responses and get your grade moving in the right direction? Simply put, by discussing the context of a text, you are showing the examiner that you actually understand the situation you're talking about. It shows that you have strong knowledge about what happens at a particular moment in the story, how that moment came to be, why it came to be, and what happens afterwards as a result of this specific moment. You would also know whether a specific moment would have massive implications later on in the plot, which is something that could be crucial if you're discussing character development or plot development or foreshadowing, for instance. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, when Romeo kills Tybalt, that is a hugely significant moment because of the implications it has for the rest of the plot. As a direct consequence of this moment, Romeo is banished from Verona, which means he can't be with Juliet, which then leads to the friar concocting this plan to try and reunite them, which ultimately fails and leads to the main characters' deaths. So being able to confidently link to different points in the narrative and discuss their connections is a higher level skill that you will be rewarded for by the examiner. But it's very important to remember that context isn't only what's happening within a text. It is also key to our understanding as readers to consider the real world events and circumstances that will have influenced its creation. Going back to our Romeo and Juliet example, most of the male characters are violent, confrontational, and will lap up any opportunity for a fight. But why did Shakespeare make them this way? Well, Shakespeare was writing in what we call a patriarchal society, which meant it was controlled and all the major decisions were made by men. And as a result of that, this idea of men at the time was that they had to constantly be showing authority and strength. And if any men at the time ever displayed any emotions that didn't align with that image, they would be considered feminine and weak as a result. This is what we recognise today as being toxic masculinity. However, Shakespeare deliberately challenges this expectation by making Romeo, one of his two central characters, and a man, incredibly emotionally driven and sensitive. But why does Shakespeare do this? We don't know for certain, but we can speculate that perhaps Shakespeare was trying to show his audience what happens to an Elizabethan man who's overly sensitive and emotional. Or perhaps he was trying to make the point that a patriarchal society fails its men who are sensitive and emotional, because it tries to force them into a mould in which they don't fit. And when they try to break away from this mould, it ends in tragedy, as it does for Romeo. In some ways, we are simply guessing at what Shakespeare may have intended. We can't know for certain because, well, he's dead. So we can't exactly ask him what he meant. But what we can do, and this is vital when analysing any kind of literature, is we can be led by the text itself. And then we can combine that with our knowledge and understanding of the writer and their beliefs, combined with what we know about the culture and society in which they were writing, so that we can deliver a much deeper and complex analysis. The more thoughtful and insightful your analysis, the more marks you can be awarded by the examiner, if you follow these 3 steps to success. Step 1. Keep it relevant. Only ever include contextual information that is relevant to the point you're trying to make. For example, if you're analysing the toxic masculinity amongst the male characters in Romeo and Juliet, and you decide to include some contextual information about Shakespeare being a part owner of the Globe Theatre, whilst that is true and accurate, it isn't relevant to the point you're trying to make. And in that case, you won't get any marks from the examiner, and they'll probably just think you're confused. So make sure the context you include and discuss is relevant to your point. It's very important. Step 2. Less can be more. This ties in with the first step. Remember, you're not writing a history book. So don't just throw in bits of context left, right and centre because they're the only things you can remember. You must only use background information that will strengthen the point you're trying to make. To help you avoid falling into this very common trap, make sure that you spend some time before you even start writing to plan out each of your paragraphs so that you know exactly what you're going to talk about, you know exactly what the point is you're going to be making in each paragraph, and so you know exactly what pieces of background information are relevant and how they will strengthen the point you're trying to make. The key is in the preparation, so make sure you prepare well. Step 3. Confidence is key. Discussing context successfully is something that can only be achieved if you have a strong knowledge of the text and some of the key contributing factors that may have influenced its creation. Your teachers will have covered this information with you, but if you're sitting there right now thinking, well, gee shucks, I don't know anything about Shakespeare or Elizabethan England, or about whatever text that it is you're studying, then the fix is really, really simple. Do some research. You can ask your teacher to point you in the right direction. You could flick through a revision guide. You can even go on Google or YouTube. There are resources everywhere and incredibly accessible to you. A good rule of life is you can't expect people to just tell you everything all the time. Sometimes you need to go out there and find that information for yourself and take on that responsibility. Now bear in mind, you don't need to know absolutely everything about what was going on at the time, but you do need to be able to demonstrate a clear understanding of how some of these real world events and beliefs and influences may have had a profound impact on the text itself. That is where the higher marks will come from. Now, knowing what contextual information is and the fact you need to include it is one thing, but that's not everything. You still need to have a strong understanding of how to structure an analytical paragraph so that you know when and where to include the different pieces of information. For help with that, watch this video here, in which I talk you through step by step how to write a successful reading response paragraph.
Polar bears